In September of 1971, a group of inmates in upstate New York broke down the gate that surrounded their living quarters, took a number of guards hostage, and declared control of the correctional facility. What followed over the next couple of days would become the single most important event in the history of American prison rights: the Attica prison uprising. The conditions at Attica were terrible. It was massively overcrowded, inmates were allowed only one shower per week, they spent the majority of their day inside of tiny cells, and were subject to frequent beatings. The month before the uprising, George Jackson, a prominent prison rights activist who was incarcerated himself, was murdered by guards at the San Quentin Correctional Facility in California. The day after his death, 700 inmates at Attica protested by putting on black armbands and sitting silently through their lunch period, refusing food. The guards who witnessed this event were reportedly terrified, and tensions within the prison began to rise. A couple weeks later, Attica's warden, Vincent Mancusi, decided to punish the members of one of the cell blocks for a relatively minor offense by taking away their breakfast, but he failed to notify the guards that this was happening. So when the guards went in to take the prisoners out of their cell block, they found the doors to the breakfast hall locked. The prisoners believed that they were about to be beaten. Some of them tried to flee, and others began to riot. The chaos began to spread, and eventually hundreds of panicking men pressed up against the gate that separated them from the central area of the prison. A faulty weld in the gate broke, and the uprising began, with the prisoners taking 42 Attica employees hostage. Within hours, the prisoners had organized themselves into one of the most remarkable societies in American history. They elected representatives, set up a medical and food distribution system, and even sectioned off an area where the media was allowed in so that they could give press conferences. Tom Wicker, a southern white journalist who worked for the New York Times and observed Attica during the uprising, described it in this way: "The racial harmony that prevailed among the prisoners was absolutely astonishing. That prison yard was the first place I had ever seen where there was no racism." The inmates came up with a list of 33 demands and submitted them to Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Their de facto leader was a 21-year-old named L.D. Barkley, who gave rousing speeches to the media, saying that the inmates at Attica were tired of being treated like beasts. Governor Rockefeller, however, refused to give in to the prisoners' demands. It was later discovered that during the 4-day period of negotiation, he had been in direct contact with President Nixon, who praised the governor's tough handling of the situation. Despite his failure in this moment, Rockefeller would later go on to be named vice president under Gerald Ford. After 4 days, the state abruptly terminated negotiations, despite the fact that the lawyer representing the prisoners had said that they may have been only hours away from a compromise. 600 state troopers, sheriff deputies, and corrections officers surrounded the walls of the prison. They removed their badges and scratched the serial numbers off their weapons. Many of them had brought personal firearms, which they loaded with hollow-tip bullets meant to expand on impact so as to be more deadly. Then, with no warning, they stormed the prison, firing over 2,000 rounds in 15 minutes. When it was over, 29 inmates and 10 hostages were dead. The state announced that the hostages had had their throats slit by the prisoners, and this was widely reported by the press. But within days, it was actually discovered that every single one of the hostages had been killed by gunfire from the attacking officers. The survivors of the attack reported that after the initial melee, when all of the inmates had been subdued, the state troopers continued to systematically hunt down and execute the leaders of the rebellion, many of whom surrendered with their hands up. The attackers apparently repeatedly called out L.D. Barkley by name, searching for him through the smoke of the tear gas. He was found dead the next day with a special hollow-tip bullet in his back. He had just a couple days left on his sentence. In response to the uprising and the protests that followed it, the New York State Department of Corrections implemented a number of changes that improved quality of life for prisoners, yet most of these changes were repealed during the tough-on-crime era of the 80s and 90s. Some historians have argued that these temporary reforms were actually meant to undercut the organizing and activism taking place within prison by driving a wedge between the reformist and revolutionary factions of the inmate population. America spends $182 billion a year to put 1.9 million people behind bars, more than half of whom are non-violent offenders. Yes, a functioning society needs some system of crime and punishment, but ours is fundamentally broken and it needs to be reformed.